Welcome to the Sports Ethicist Show, coming to you from the basement of Burpee on the campus of Rockford University in Sportstown, USA, Rockford, Illinois. I am Shawn Klein, the Sports Ethicist. The Sports Ethicist Show discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download podcasts of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and Twitter. You can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. Now, as a philosopher with a deep and abiding interest in sport, one of the questions I often get is why sport? Or more likely what these folks really mean is, how can an intellectual be interested in something so obviously without intellectual value? The sport is just not seen as serious. I mean, how often do we hear professional athletes referred to as millionaires playing a kid's game? But this is not a new question. George Santayana, one of the great American philosophers, wrestled with this question over 100 years ago. In his Philosophy on the Bleachers, published in the Harvard Monthly in 1894, Santayana tries to answer the question, quote, why do you go to games? Why do you waste your time upon the bleachers? Luckily enough, my friend and colleague Matt Flamm is a Santayana scholar, the most prestigious Santayana scholar I know. His most recent work is a new book, George Santayana at 150 International Interpretations. He also co-edited and authored Under Any Sky, Contemporary Readings of George Santayana. In addition to scholarly articles on Santayana, he also wrote the entry on Santayana in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I'll put up a link to all these on sportsethicist.com. Now, in today's show, Matt and I are going to discuss this essay, Philosophy on the Bleachers, and Santayana's answer to the question of why sport. So, welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks, Shawn. This is a privilege, and most especially just to join my good friend and colleague talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Before we get into Santayana's wonderful article, I think it might be helpful for our listeners to know a little bit more about Santayana. So I'm going to throw the ball to you, and could you tell us a little bit more about his life and, you know, just like the basic essence of his philosophy?
Cool. Yeah, this is fun. Kid in a candy store stuff for me. He's an esoteric figure. He's something of an antique. Santayana being associated with American philosophy is probably the best, as good a place as any to begin, because his name right away should strike people as not necessarily sounding particularly American, and
right.
Sure enough, he is Spanish and was born in Spain in 1863. His years overlap exactly, despite his birth year, almost exactly with John Dewey, another, the face of American philosophy, exact contemporaries. The fact that he was born in Spain but comes to be known as one of the major figures of classical American philosophy is itself interesting. So he spent the first 8 years of his life in Spain due to his having been born. He was born there because of the fact that his Spanish mother had a very brief relationship with came to be his father, and her second marriage, brief, with a Spaniard, and Agustin Ruiz Santayana.
That's a great name.
And yeah, so he remained in Spain right after Santayana was born with Santayana, while his wife then migrated to United States. Her previous marriage, her husband, George Sturgis, who had passed away, had a lot of money. And so he one of the terms of her inheriting that money was to raise the kids in America. So that's partly why she went to America. So she goes to America. She brings Santayana's sister, who he was very close to, and with the intention of raising her there in Boston, but also with the intention of Santayana following them there. Right. And in fact, the original intent, I think, was Santayana's father, and he would follow them there and stay there. But it turned out that when Santayana was 8 and they took the boat trip and everything, his father just, America wasn't for him. Okay. So his father kind of left him there. And that's significant, had to have a real psychological impact on the young Santayana, I'm sure. And
so he would have been, like 10 at that point when his father?
He was 8. And very young. He'd only spoken Spanish as far as we know up to that point. I'm sure he had a little bit of English, but it can't have been that developed. Mm-hmm. So really significant that he comes to then master the English language and write exclusively in the English language,
and beautifully so. Yeah. Now, did he speak with an accent? Do you know what his like?
Good question, because I always wish there was a recording. There is a recording of John Dewey, which is very boring to listen to, and it's not surprising to hear John Dewey's voice. Given if you know his prose pretty well, he kind of talks like he writes, which I like John Dewey's prose as much, but Santayanas is quite beautiful by comparison. But Santayana, he's said to have spoken kind of like a dandy. I picture him as something like he being raised in the Boston Brahmin, golden age of Harvard atmosphere. There's a kind of a sophisticated, Eastern educated American accent, common to that. And I picture him having that now.
The way you describe him, it makes me think kind of like Niles Crane, but with more of a Boston accent.
Probably, yeah. And that probably is as good of any of a kind of a picture to form in your mind as much as those help. Although there are some really good, vivid descriptions by friends. It's a wonderful book called A Dialogue on George Santayana that was written just at the time of his death. That's very free-flowing and gossipy-like even. It's kind of fun to read because it's like Horace Callan and it's, other people who knew Santayana, and they are just chatting about memories they had of Santayana, and a lot of really interesting things come out of that, and among them is his appearance and his cadence and things like that. Yeah.
Now, he never married.
Nope, yeah.
And there's also no real discussion of romantic partners?
No, it's pretty clear he was a homosexual.
Okay. I was wondering, because from that period of history, when you read, never married and it never really, the sexuality doesn't ever come up. You wonder in that period that was often a euphemism or a way that people just kind of papered over homosexuality or something.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very clear. If you read the letters, the evidence for his homosexuality, there's maybe two bits. One is that he made a comment to his literary executor, Daniel Corey, at one point. He said, "I suppose in those days at Harvard, I was what people call a homosexual," and he says it that way. Okay, so there you go, right? But
that's pretty good evidence.
Yeah. And he very much liked the company of young, attractive men, and throughout his life, they gravitated towards him. He was a poet, and very often the young romantic poets, many of whom were homosexual themselves. They liked Santayana, who was a mentor and one of the more popular professors during that period at Harvard because of his. He was a very sociable guy. He liked to have gatherings at his small little apartment room after lectures, and back in the day when you could open a bottle of wine with students and undergrads without worrying about litigation, probably.
Right.
But he did these things. Now,
well, I need to say, just reading this essay, which is the only thing that I really, only a thing of his I've ever read. There does come across a more down-to-earth kind of personality in academia. Not so it wasn't. You can imagine that William James or Royce and these other that they probably were kind of highfalutin. It would probably be hard to engage with them. Whereas he seems more like someone that you really could sit down with some wine and get into a good conversation with him, that he didn't seem to have airs about him, I guess would be.
Yeah, it's cool to hear that impression because I think the same. Although, and what's odd, of course, is that the reputation of Santayana as it's come to be developed in his legacy compared to people like James and others is that, well, James and Dewey and even Royce, they were philosophers of the common man, and the intimation there being that they are every person's philosopher and therefore more accessible somehow. But the truth is, personally, Santayana, I think, really could be argued to have been more accessible. He, especially to the young, to the young.
Dewey might have been a philosopher of the common man, but how much did he hang out with the common man? I doubt a lot.
Yeah, good point.
Whereas, I don't know about Santayana either, but the fact that he was sitting in the bleachers in the field, he probably had more of an engagement with the so-called common man than someone who wasn't going to the games and watching a game of football or baseball.
Yeah, that's a great subject, for another time, of course, but one side comment would be that, Dewey, who was a worldly philosopher and he traveled widely throughout his life, you could argue he kind of kept his distance from people through his engagement. There's a kind of a funny paradox there,
yeah.
And there's an ability to do that. The more the more worldly in the sense of being traveled and moving around and never really staying in one place, the least contact you have to have with people. So there might have been that. There might be that argument you could have for Dewey, and I'm sure there's a good argument that he was just as accessible as anybody. So
that's probably getting a little bit far afield. A little more.
Yeah.
Now, one word there that you used to describe him was antique, and that kind of tickled me in a sense. And wanting to come back and ask you what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think just in the, canon of philosophers and the kind of philosophers and the way he is thought about, he's thought something as something of an antique. Compared to Emerson, is a good comparison there because within the American tradition, I think Emerson and Santayana could be argued to be, first of all, the best writers. I mean, I think it's pretty, at least I'd make that argument. But in addition, they're the most quoted and probably least read. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And the most quotable. And Santayana is most known for those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. So the quote is misquoted, requoted, paraphrased, etched above, numerous grave sites, including, I believe, in Auschwitz.
Yes.
And so, he's quoted, he's quotable like Emerson, but seldom read. And one criticism against him is something along those lines. Bertrand Russell says something to that effect. You can be lulled into a kind of admiration and attraction by his writing style, but once you get below that, or behind that, as it were, there's not much there. That's kind of Bertrand Russell's view, and of course I disagree with that.
Yeah, I think that I would probably flip that. I'm not a big Russell fan, but and it also strikes me that just reading this piece and the little I've read of Russell as well, they're really up to very different things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So related to Russell and related to something we said a second ago, just as to finish our little gossipy point, I suppose, about the homosexuality of Santayana, the other bit of evidence is that it's very clear he had basically probably a love affair, but definitely a love infatuation with Russell's elder brother, the elder Russell. And you get
that is a bit gossipy, but
yeah,
interesting.
But it's quite clear from, and actually this is something I have published as well. There's a review of one of the volumes of letters in which you can find these letters that reveal this essentially. And Santayana has a couple of letters that are very clearly reflective of some relations he had with the elder Russell, but then Russell somehow spurned him in some way, and it's all very suggested, but it's quite clear. And Santayana went so far as to put his own reputation and life on the line at one time for the elder Russell by testifying in his defense at one of his divorce proceedings, I think it was. I'm not offhand exactly sure, but it was, it's significant that he had this sort of relationship with the elder Russell, and he always had an attraction to English culture, which is a related point. He wrote soliloquies in England when he spent time in World War I in England, and says much about English culture that he in praise of English culture.
Well, and then eventually. Another sort of irony of him being, listed as one of the greats of American philosophy is he does spend the last half of his life in Europe and never comes back to the States, correct? Yep.
Yeah. So back to the biography. So he comes to the States at 8. He has this wonderfully formal and rich education at Boston Latin School. He's mastering English at this time, as well as, all the classics, getting a kind of classics education. I'm sure it barely exists today if it does. And of course, in that period of training for philosophers, when he eventually did go to graduate school and study philosophy under his teachers, William James and Josiah Royce, who was his dissertation advisor, he eventually would travel to Berlin, to Germany, and other parts of Europe to continue his study. That was kind of expected of, especially graduate students in philosophy at that time, another feature of his upbringing. So he spends that.
Now, is that partly also because of sort of the influence of German idealism and German romanticism?
Absolutely. And it was a very good requirement, and understandable, and one that I kind of think in some senses should still be in place. You can't understand American philosophy at all without appreciating its roots in German idealism, and Emersonian transcendentalism comes out of Kant and German idealism and romanticism. So it really stands to reason that anybody considered trained in American philosophy or as an American philosopher ought to probably have some familiarity with that. And they all knew German, and German culture was something with which they became acquainted, and they knew their Hegel and Kant really well. So Dewey in his earliest days was very hardcore Hegelian. It's interesting to read his earliest essays. So, but yeah, back to his biography.
I can see that.
So Santayana is in America until 1912, and that takes us through his, graduating with a PhD in the 1880s to becoming a Harvard professor right after that. So he goes from being student to being colleague of Royce and James. Palmer is another of his colleagues who's also a well-known Harvard professor. At that time, a guy named George Eliot is well known as the president of Harvard, is kind of the symbolic university president who's the face of the coming next wave of progressive education. I mean, progressive education had yet to come about. Dewey and his work had yet to take full seed in America and really plan itself in such a way that progressive education would flourish. But it certainly was the beginning of the elective system in higher education. In fact, Santayana writes a mockery of it in the Lampoon that he was an author of himself. Santayana wrote quite a bit in the Harvard Lampoon and actually performed in the Hasty Pudding, I think it's called.
Yes, that's what it's called.
Yeah, where Santayana dressed up in drag a few times. So he was fond of comedy, and he was involved in
which
that.
was generally part of Hasty Pudding. I mean, that still to this day is a tradition in terms of dressing in drag.
Yeah. And the Harvard Lampoon still exists, as we know. Yeah. But Santayana was a part of all that stuff, very active. But I'm kind of mixing up his biography. So what happens is, though, he becomes a Harvard professor, becomes known. At the time he writes this article you refer to, which we'll get into, of course, this is 1894. He's only been a Harvard professor for, 5 years, 6 years.
Okay.
And, maybe a little more than that, 7 or so years. And so he is acclimated to that life. He's a full-on academic. But he's 2 years from writing the first work for which he becomes philosophically recognized, and that's The Sense of Beauty. So kind of put it in that context. But what happens after that is he, by 1912, he decides to leave Harvard. And at that point, he's at the apex of his academic career. He has only to go to, to become the chair and to really just sort of, do what all the other professors did and retire as a professor at Harvard. But he's not sure, and his mom dies around that time, and he inherits money, and that's the impetus for him going over to Europe. And at the time, he was somewhat ambiguous to his friends about whether he would come back or not, and he was asked to do various other things, too, to go have appointments elsewhere, and he said no to all of them. He ended up going to Europe and never coming back. So he gets stuck in World War I in England for a while, writes some books, and then he ends up migrating south to Rome, where again, he spent the latter half of his life and died. So
which is this irony of him not being a native born American and then not living here for a good chunk of his life in the latter part of his life, and yet making such an impact on American philosophy.
And it's that I really like about Santayana. I've always liked the outsider perspective.
Yeah,
I've always liked the outsider point of view. That's one of the things I'm attracted. But everything you just said is
it's interesting. I mean, he occupies at least as far as I can tell, a really interesting spot of being an outsider, but at the same time, he's an insider. The guy is at Harvard. Yeah. There isn't certainly at this time, there isn't anything more on the inside of American culture and the American elite than being at Harvard. And so he is, in a way, a consummate insider, but then because I think of his foreign born and just some sensibilities was a bit of an outsider as well. And I think that probably adds to the richness of his comments and ideas about American society, including sport.
No doubt. So a lot more to be said about that in particular. He has many great portraits of his colleagues James and Royce, and many of them eviscerating. He was a harsh critic in his own way. He could be. But to this article that you're referring to, this is our subject, and I like it as a subject. And we were both agreeing before we went on air here that and this is, Shawn's read this article, maybe only this, Santayana's. I don't know if you've read it.
This is the only thing I've ever read of Santayana.
So. But Shawn was commenting, and I would agree, it's probably in its own way a kind of a nice embodiment of just about everything in the larger sense that you could take from Santayana's thinking, which includes a mature system of ontology where he articulates categories of essence, truth, matter, and spirit, and he's a materialist. All these other more complicated conceptual features of Santayana's thinking are kind of anticipated in this very early work before he develops this stuff. So
I mean, you definitely can see the materialist element in terms of the engagement of the body in something, the vitality of bringing your body to bear into an activity, but then the unification with mind in a way, right, to bring the spirit, I guess, together. I mean, I think the the idea of essence and truth probably isn't there as much.
Right.
And I mean, maybe a little bit when he starts talking about like the deeper human nature, the deeper aspirations that are here, and he talks about instinct and things like that might be driving us, which I do. Again, I'm gleaming these from your article in the Internet Encyclopedia, as well as the Stanford article in Stanford Encyclopedia, as well as Wikipedia, and as my research, and you know, those are good as far as they go, but so they're not, you know, I'm not the expert here, but you know, you pick up on those elements, and you pick up on the Emersonian aspects. There's also and this is something I think that you probably speak to. There's a Nietzschean element here as well. But of course there's a Nietzschean element in Emerson too, but because you wrote an article on something like that, right? Santayana and Nietzsche.
Santayana and Nietzsche. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, didn't you?
Yeah. And every once in a while, you know, that's an article I'd write differently today, I suppose, but it not that I would reverse any of major claims I make in it or something like that, but I was trying in that article to contend with Santayana has a very trenchant critique of German philosophy, and Egotism in German Philosophy is the name of the book in which he presents a lot of these views.
Okay.
And not dissimilar from Dewey, it's certainly bound up to some extent in the political atmosphere of the time in which he wrote the book, where there's a lot of anti-German sentiment and so forth. And so I'm kind of contending with that there. And Santayana has kind of casts Nietzsche in an interesting way. He's kind of like Nietzsche's more of a modernist. Basically, in very brief summary of what I'm conveying there is that Santayana effectively argues that Nietzsche's really more of a modernist, and all these people appropriating him for postmodernism might be on the wrong track or something like that. So
that's interesting.
Interesting claim of Santayana's. Yeah.
I guess the way that I see the Nietzschean element really is at the towards the end of the article, where he's really getting at what he thinks is the core value of engaging as well as spectating sport, in terms of this sort of connection of vitality and disinterestedness, it struck me that his critique there, both of modern society and what to resolve it, struck me as kind of Nietzschean, right? So he gets into this. I'm completely going backwards from what I anticipated doing.
That's all right.
That's fine. That's the point of this, right? So, right, he says on page, at least on my version, 189 of the article. Now, it's on 188. The chief claim which athletics make upon our respect remains yet unmentioned. So this is near the end of the article. Yep. He's talked about all these different interesting ideas of what the value of sport is. And then, of course, now I'm going to tell you what I really think. He says, they unite vitality with disinterestedness. The curse of our time is industrial supremacy, the sacrifice of every spontaneous faculty in liberal art to the demands of an overgrown material civilization. And so there's this, I mean, the spontaneous faculty sounds very Nietzschean to me as well. This need for that society, culture, in some way, civilization is keeping down the spontaneous will of the individual to flourish and make their choices. All that, I mean, that could come out of Nietzsche. And then on the other hand, you know, he talks about, how in a way our life is atrophied because, I mean, he doesn't put it in so many terms, but, you know, our basic needs are met. No one's really living on the edge of survival. I mean, you know, I mean, that's even more true today than it was then. I mean, certainly, at least in the West, we have our problems, but, you know, for the most part, no one's on the edge of survival. So there's this weird paradox, which again, I think is in Nietzsche, that at the same time, we, you know, the Industrial Revolution, industrial society leaves us both with this sort of vulgar materialism and drive for stuff that crushes us. But we also, the other side of that is we have all this stuff that we need to live, and so now what the hell do we do? Yeah. And so there's this emptiness that we have, this malaise, this angst, right? And I think that's where the existentialists pick up in Nietzsche. And so I get the feeling for that. And his resolution is you know, at least in some sense, sport, because it engages your full being into something that, although, you know, is artificial, does test so much every part of your being, and so it really gives you that sense of your survival on the line. And so you engage those faculties, even in the face of this, industrial tyranny, as he calls it.
Yeah, strong language there.
I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that critique, but I think it's really fascinating. And also, I mean, I was just reading and going, wow, I mean, this is so, at least in certain moods, Nietzsche, right? I mean, Nietzsche is like a lot of the German philosophers, depending on what mood you catch him in, it can be a completely different thinker. But, I mean, so in terms of my reading of that, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that's definitely a connection I would not disagree with, and I think that's insightful. That's definitely the part of the essay to focus in on for the kind of heart of what he's trying to get across. And absolutely, he goes so far as to say it may sound ridiculous, but sport may be the one sort of outlet for Americans to get around this, to get revenge against, to escape this. Malaise, this materialistic, industrialized,
Well, here's the quote, and I'm going to quote a lot from him. I usually don't in the podcast because, I mean, who wants to listen to me read? But, I mean, the text is just beautiful, and even if I don't always agree with him, the man can turn a phrase, I'll tell you that. So, that quote is on page 189. It may seem a ridiculous thing, and yet I think it's true, that our athletic life is the most conspicuous and promising rebellion against the industrial tyranny. We elude mammon only for a few years, which the Philistines think are wasted. It's just beautiful in a way. I mean, that's also, I can see where Russell and others might critique him and sort of saying, yeah, but what are you really saying?
Yeah.
Right? It's beautiful. But
nice poetry, right?
Right. But I think there's a real critique there. Again, I question some of his premises about this sort of industrial supremacy and tyranny and the idea that this has led us to a kind of vulgar instrumentalism and materialism in the bad sense, because he's a materialist in a different sort of metaphysical sense, but in the consumer society sense of materialism. I mean, there's some truth to it, of course, but I think as a bald critique, I question that premise. But I think if he's it's an interesting way to put it, that's for sure.
I think one thing you could say to bring all perspectives kind of into some amount of relief in regard to this question of the materialism of our times, however, strongly one feels that we are, somehow trapped by or harmed by or hampered by or otherwise limited by this material culture in which we live. Whatever one's view is on that, it's no question. I think everyone would agree that in these times of plenty and privilege and, lack of want, for all the ways we could put it, we do cast about for some forms of escape, and not novel forms of escape, even. And I do agree. That's where I think Santayana's correct
what's
about
interesting,
sport.
you say escape. He never uses that term.
Yeah.
And now maybe that could be an anachronism in terms of using that term. But there's a sense that I feel like he would disagree with that idea, that it's not really an escape, in the sense of going to a movie, taking a break.
Yeah,
it seems like because escapism, it seems more like a vacation, and I think he's, it's a break from something, and I think he sees it as something a little bit deeper, as something really, not so much escaping, but really engaging ourselves in an artificial world, but one that still engages us.
Yeah.
And so and gives us that vitality.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the escapism often can be used in a way that is belittling, I guess. And I don't mean that you were saying that, but that it's often meant as something that's like, well, there's the real stuff, and then you escape occasionally, and you go on vacation, and
you need distraction.
Distraction
might even be the word. No, that's a well-placed word of caution. The thing not to take away from Santayana's remarks is to think that he's advocating that sports in terms of some form of escape or distraction, in the terms of distraction. Earlier in the essay, he in fact addresses that, right? He's talking about the two most common ways that we kind of undermine sport as a endeavor. We say either it's just sort of idle, it's idle distraction of some kind, or escaping in that way, or it's alternatively, he keeps using this term gymnastics, which I take him to mean just exercise, going to the gym, or just keeping your health up in gymnastics.
Well, here's the quote, right? Again, I told you I'm going to quote him, right? So page 181 is the very first page of the essay. If it is not mere indolence that brings the spectators to our games, Neither is it the mere need of healthy exercise that brings the players. So yeah, he does dismiss the sort of standard argument. Oh, well, sport's good because it's healthy for you.
Yeah.
And the spectators go, well, it's laziness. It's just, just sheer leisure. And I think he's expressing disagreement with both. I mean, now there are instances where those are true, but certainly I think the idea of sport, or at least, he does seem to be drawing some distinctions between sport and athletics, in a way. But in terms of athletics and public athletics, I mean, we know now it's really not that healthy for you, right? Certainly most of the major sports, there's some of the preparation for to be an elite athlete obviously is good for you, but I think it goes beyond that. It goes certainly beyond a maintenance of healthy fitness for, a normal life. Yeah.
There's another part of his essay you make me think of there in that line where another feature of this essay that I'd forgotten of until I reread it actually, where he's also connecting it with youth in a really interesting philosophical way. And it makes me rethink our sports culture today and kind of maybe take a more critical eye than I usually do in that way. Is that one of the issues with contemporary commercial sports is that we do kind of use up, chew up, and literally destroy so many human beings on its behalf. I'm watching all these analyses of, what do athletes do, pro athletes do after they retire and stuff, and people are talking about their lives after sport. And so much of the talk is reflective of a very unhealthy relation to sport because, there's these people who literally have no identity or existence after sport. And so there's that, but then there's the fact that their bodies are destroyed. So, but Santayana's comments about youth are that, I take him to be saying something like, well, one of the reasons why, especially college athletics are, especially at that time, mind you, this is well before the commercial age of sports, so that's the other difference here.
Although he's even referring to it already, which is, you'd have to, when someone at that point is already referring to professionalization as
there's no television sports. There's no, there's so many differences. I mean, it'd be really interesting to update Santayana's views here, and that might be a future project. But he's referring there to, how youth, it's appropriate for us to especially sit in the bleachers and cheer on teams in college settings because what we're doing there is we're also cheering on youth and its impermanence. And there's a line in there too where he says something to the effect of, the young are at the same time as they have yet to have amounted to anything, they're also they have infinite potential, right? And it's right. That's part of youth that we are kind of cheering on when we cheer on the athlete. We're looking at that in terms of, anything can happen from here on out for these athletes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of what you're saying there, although I do think, because at another point he does, when we say youth, that covers a wide range, because he does say on page 185, athletic sports are not children's games.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is a sense of a kind of a more seriousness.
Yeah.
But he follows on, they are public spectacles in which young men,
yeah,
right, carefully trained and disciplined, contend with one another in feats of strength, skill, and courage. So there still is the youth aspect of it, and some of it, I think, is he does sort of treat it on one hand both as, well, duh, because, when you're 40,
yeah,
as we can speak to, yeah, it's hard to engage in sport on a regular basis. But, when you're 20, you can just do it, right? Yeah. I mean, you can power through things that you just can't. And, we've seen this in the Olympics. I mean, I don't know how much of it is in effect, but, when I wrote a blog post the other day about how several of the American skiing contenders and snowboarding contenders, Shawn White, Shawnee Davis, and other, Bodie Miller, right? They were supposed to medal gold, they were, they're the kings of their professions. They didn't medal.
Yeah.
Right. Or they haven't medaled yet. I don't know if Shawnee Davis has another shot. I know, but,
sure.
And I don't know about Bodie Miller, but I think they're done. And I think they didn't medal in the sports that they were supposed to medal in.
Yeah.
And some of that, there's other reasons that might be there, but some of that might be, they're all getting old, at least for that profession. They're not necessarily old by comparison to other things, but, although Bodie Miller's getting up there. And so, your body starts to break down. It just can't quite take the abuse that the sport gives you. So it makes sense that it's more focused on the young.
Yeah, that's another important clarification. By youth, he means not young kids. What he means is there's a very brief window when you think about it where any human, any creatures really at their physical best. And one of the things we're all the spectacle part of sport that is such a draw is that aspect of, you're seeing, I mean, football's a great example of this. You're seeing human beings at their absolute pitch of power and perfection. Right. And it's quite an amazing thing to behold. And that's what Santayana means by that association of athleticism with youth, you know, right. Flashing moment.
Well, and here's the quote I think you were referring to before. Let's see. On page 189. But while we are young and as yet amount to nothing, we retain the privilege of infinite potentiality. That's great. The poor actuality has not yet taken its place, and in giving one thing made everything else forever unattainable. But in youth, the intellectual part is too mature to bear much fruit. That would come later if the freedom could be retained. The body alone has reached perfection, and very naturally, the physical life is what tends to occupy the interval of leisure with its exuberances. Such is the origin of our athletics. I mean, that's beautiful in its own way, and I think there is some truth to that. And then I think also as you age, the spectacle aspect comes in, because it is a way of vicariously experiencing that again, and living that again, and seeing it again, and that's not unimportant and not without value. Yeah,
it's also just an amazing, feature of what it is to exist. You know, I think a lifespan is full of amazing trajectories of growth and diminishment of powers and increases of powers. And I think that's what Santayana is sort of referring to there. Yeah. I mean, this is early Santayana, and one of the other distinctions about that from his later work is that he is, he's kind of swept up somewhat in the kind of, 1850s to 1920s or so period in which there was a great preoccupation with kind of a Darwinian sense of progression and kind of a more pre-war optimism, if you will, about the course of humankind and so on. And there's a little bit of that here. There's a little bit of that idea of humans evolving in directions of greater and greater power and potentiality and so forth.
Well, and also parallel to that, and for similar causes, I think is and maybe you know more about this. There was a sense here in certain parts where I'm picking up echoes of what's sometimes called muscular Christianity. Do you know much about that?
No, the phrase isn't familiar, but I might.
Well, it was sort of a Victorian age, so 19th century. Right, if I get the terminology right, latter part of the 1800s, or right when this is being written, where there was this sort of sense of we need to bring more manliness into our lives, right? That Christianity was in some way just simplicator was just too kind of wimpy
or something,
right? So we need to be or we need to be more manly in our and this was somehow also connected with the ideas of the martial virtues and the martial traits, which, again, in the pre-war optimism, before you get in World War I, mean, there was a sense of a peaceful period. I mean, this is a relatively peaceful time. And so there was a sort of, what are we going to do with all these young men who want to go out and have, courage and challenge themselves and do great honorable things and be noble. I mean, you can almost hear Churchill in the background, as these driving forces. And so there's this movement of muscular Christianity and this idea of martial virtues. I'm looking for my notes here.
No, I think there's something possibly there. Whether that specifically is there, there's, the more I think about this, the more interesting it becomes is that in a climate, and Santayana does make remarks in this essay about, if you take like ancient Greece and so forth and you look at the ancient games, these were things developed out of times of relative peace. And he's trying to work out the relation between war and sport there. And that might be what you've...
Yeah, and that's where that section is. And he talks about that and how, one of the conventional views was that these games, the javelin throw, it all comes out of war, and they were just testing and developing the skills for war. And, there may be some truth to that, but they also take on a life of their own, far beyond anything that was particular to developing skills for war. But they were kind of connected in with that. But he says on page 183, it was not the utility of athletics for war that supported the Greek games. On the contrary, the games arose from the comparative freedom from war and the consequent liberation of martial energy from the stimulus of necessity, and the expression of it in beautiful and spectacular forms.
Yeah.
So that I think what he's trying to say, and I'd like your input on this, because there is a sense in him that there's this, what is he called, the animal instincts. Is that kind of part of his idea?
I think so.
Yeah. That we have these sort of drives, and that underlying I don't necessarily think he's saying, well, we have these martial virtues or character traits, and we need to redirect them. Yeah. I think he saw underneath there was these instinctual drives for certain kinds of things that human beings need: a testing of themselves, a kind of courage, a sense of integrity and effectiveness in the world, that the martial virtues and being engaged in that sort of chivalrous and sort of structure of the military and engaging in war that, in this period wasn't like the war today, right? It wasn't total war quite yet, and it wasn't, it was the gentleman's kind of war, right? You'd go out to war, but you'd come back. Like, people didn't die. Well, people did, obviously, but there was a romanticism to it. Yeah. And so those martial virtues tapped into the more basic instincts that we had. And I think that one of the things that people were doing in this period, in the pre-World War I period, was trying to figure out, well, now what? What now? Because war wasn't going to do it anymore. Yeah. Particularly as you get into, and now the thing that I think we see in the more contemporary idea is certainly war isn't going to do it. Yeah. Right? Because it's too dangerous. Right? It's too destructive. And so we need something else that's going to do that. Not so much tap into our martial virtues, but tap into these instincts or drives or characters or components of human flourishing that we need to develop and test that we don't necessarily get in other areas of our life, but sport does. And that sport does precisely because it's both mind and body, and it's public. That those three things combine to test these kinds of things or bring out these kind of character traits. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think there's a number of possible corollaries or parallels or people who've made arguments along the lines you're talking about. I think William James argues, interestingly, in a kind of inversion of what you're talking about. He actually argues for a form of pacifism based on this way that sport could operate, or something like the militaristic virtues, the martial virtues could be sublimated or something through athletics, or something like it. And there's a need for that there's something that reaches down into the core of our nature as animals, or something like that. You made me think of Nietzsche too. If you think of
I told you Nietzsche's there.
Yeah, he somehow comes up all the time. I don't know how that is, but so there's nobility, there's honor, there are these kinds of virtues that have to do with times of conflict, times in which there's a need for masculinity and masculine virtues. But related to that, this brings us back to Santayana. We happen to be studying this in my American philosophy class right now. He does, related to this piece, but a little bit of a later period, Santayana, just before he was leaving America in 1911, gave an address before the Philosophical Union in Berkeley, California, and it's called The Genteel Tradition in American Philosophy. Now, this is a really great piece. It's widely anthologized, and what's really striking in it, he gives all these great metaphors that have become repeated, like America was an old wine in new bottles when it and stuff like that.
I didn't know that was from him.
Yeah. So, but he also coins the genteel tradition. Historians start to use that phrase after this essay. So, but also what he says in there, one of the best moments of metaphor in Santayana comes out of this essay, where he's talking about a kind of a divide in the American mind, and I think this relates with what you're talking about here. He says, the American mind is strikingly divided in this way. There's the side of the American mind that is all feminine, all genteel, and it's represented in the colonial mansion. He uses these architectural metaphors, right? So the colonial mansion. Contrast that then with the masculine, the will, the skyscraper. So he uses those two architectural metaphors to capture a divide in the American mind, also divided by sex. But what he's trying to get at there is that this is a kind of a tension in the American mind, and it's one that needs resolving. And he's suggesting that maybe philosophy is, the advance of philosophy in America kind of depends upon a resolving of that tension. That's sort of his thesis. But I find that a really powerful metaphor, however problematic in other respects, because it does seem to reflect a certain aesthetic environment that I know I encounter in America. I think he's right about there being this kind of side of ourselves that tends to kind of bend too far, bow too far, if you will, to what is traditional, what is past, and yet another part of ourselves that bows too far towards what's, the future and so forth. There's no real resolve.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're a nation that has, both Vegas
right.
and Des Moines.
Good example.
Right? I mean,
good examples, perfect.
where, I mean, Vegas, you can, if you go there once every 10 years, it's a different city every 10 years where, I would imagine that, parts of middle America, don't look any different than they did.
Years,
I mean, there's going to be some differences, but they're not that different. And people want to keep it that way. But, and so there is a weird tension there. But I think I wonder at least, that there's a deeper tension just in Western culture that just goes back to the tension between what sometimes, might be called Athens and Jerusalem, right? I mean, between the sort of the Greek, Athenian philosophic influence in our culture, which obviously, is one huge pillar of our culture, but then the other is the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is obviously a huge pillar of our culture. Yeah. And there's a lot to commend about both of them. There's a lot to be concerned about with both of them. But they also, there's some ways in which they're compatible, but there's some deep ways in which they're just not. Yeah. And so I'm often struck throughout, our culture, not just America, but of the West, that these sort of tensions run through and these sort of, cracks come up in various kind of weird places. Yeah. And I think that might be the root of it, or maybe there's even a deeper root, but, that takes us a little away from sport, but
well, Santayana does that too. One of the other features of his writing that can be very frustrating for people, and I sympathize because I get frustrated at times with it as well. He ranges so far, in even the most like informal and passing kinds of pieces of writing that he, in fact, in some senses, he's worse in those contexts where he'll raise issues that just encapsulate cosmic questions. It's like he's not very. He doesn't spend a lot of time on more manageable questions.
Right? Yeah. No. And you see that. I mean, there's definitely some pieces in here that I think beg for more of a defense. He talks about the kind of this is my term, symbiosis of the spectator and the athlete, that, and he even quotes Pindar, right? You're in trouble if someone's quoting Pindar, do you? And he said, there's a sort of, the athletics have to be these public spectacles. Athletic sports are not children's games. They're public spectacles in which young men, carefully trained and disciplined, contend with one another in feats of strength, skill, and courage. Right, so you get the sense of why the athlete's in it for, right? The young man, they got their strength, their skill that's being tested, they're contending, it's, all that's important. Then he continues, spectators are indispensable, since without them the victory, which should be the only reward, would lose half its power. For as Pindar, who knew, tells us, quote, success is half the prize, the other half renown, who both achieves, he hath the perfect crown. Which is cool. Right, and so I think there is this sense of that the public is this necessary component, that it gives power to the victory, but he never really explains why.
Yeah.
Right. Well, why does that need to be there? Why is Pindar right? Why is the renown a part of it? That's an important part of it.
That's a very good question, and that goes to the heart of the kind of philosophy of sport questions. And I think he's right, and I want to say he's right, and
I think he's right too.
And being pressed to say why is tricky. Especially you have to, when you're pressed to say why, you kind of, your mind immediately goes to the difference of context between sport in Santayana's time. I picture the bleachers at Holmes Field, and I picture those bleachers being very different than the image I got when I Googled it, which is looks like it's grown into quite a big dwelling now. And
sure.
I'm sure you've been there because you're from Boston.
I've been around there. I haven't actually been to the facility, but I've driven by it, probably on a daily basis for a good chunk of my life.
So I imagine there's huge differences there, but taking those contextual differences into account, we talk about the spectator and their relation to the sport today. It's a very, very interesting question. Necessary in the sense of, I take Santayana to mean something like this. I know when I'm playing sports, when I'm playing music, there's an analogy here, right?
Yes, absolutely.
You are playing for someone, and whether you want to be or intentionally or thinking you're doing so or not, you are. And why? Well, it's the will that is at play, if you will. I think when you're engaged in that activity, there is some sense of connection you're trying to establish. In the case of music, usually it's, for me anyway, it's mostly the attempt to have someone else go, yeah, that's something I know about too, or I've experienced too, or that's something I can connect with. Maybe it's not dissimilar for athletes.
And I think, sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure I get this.
Yeah, sure.
Is that there's, in both cases, there's something more at stake. Because that other person might say, what is Matt singing about?
Yeah.
What is he talking about? Right? Or they think, you know, and now you're a great musician, so I doubt this happens a lot. But, you know, it can happen. You know, the audience is dead, and so that's at stake. And your identity, your sense of efficacy in the world is at stake in a way that it's not when you're in your living room and jamming at home.
Yeah.
You know, even if there still is an audience, maybe your daughter or whatever, but I mean, it's going to be different than when you're out there in front of strangers. And I think it's the same with athletics. I mean, if you're shooting hoops in the backyard and you miss a bunch, you know, you're out there in the public eye, you know, on record, that's harder. I mean, we see that at the Olympics.
Yeah.
People that, you know, locally or even just nationally, they succeed very well. The Olympic stage comes, and it's just, they just can't do it.
Yep.
And, you know, I mean, there's so much going on in that, and it's, I can't imagine the pain that some of them feel because they know they can do it.
Yeah.
They can do it every time in practice.
Yep.
The crowd comes in and they fall.
Yeah.
And it just must drive them crazy. But I think that's part of what the role that the spectators play in the challenge to the athlete in increasing the importance of the event for them.
Yep. I mean, this is what's interesting but striking about that very phenomenon is that, you know, if an athlete or a musician or whatever is successful and triumphant in some respect, they will, by that very fact, they will win over an entire audience or spectating group. And that's profound. You think about one individual who triumphs in a certain kind of way can disarm an entire crowd, and sometimes huge crowds of spectators, is a powerful testament to probably what Santayana's thinking of there. I'm not sure, but that's what I think of. I think of that connection there. And
the other aspect they talked about that I think is really interesting for his case for the spectator, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff he talks about makes a lot of sense for the athlete, him or herself, of engaging their body and mind in this activity, of really putting themselves to the test, of creating a sort of drama for their life, he puts it, which I think is an interesting way to put it. You know, and puts a challenge to them, and you can see that with the athlete. But then, okay, where do the spectators come in? Well, okay, their role is to heighten the stakes for the athlete. But then what do they get out of it? What does the spectator gets out of it? And he touches on that. And that's one of the things I like about this essay, is that it's not just a defense from the athlete's point of view. It's not just a defense of spectatorship. It's defense of both, which makes sense because he sees them as closely connected. So you can't defend one without the other. But he brings in the idea of imagination and, as you know, at one point he says the whole soul is stirred by the spectacle. And so it's not just the athlete who has their mind and body and their whole being as being engaged in it. The spectator does too, in a different way, right? They're not put to the test in the same kind of way, but something he doesn't really mention is, you know, the individual's identity. And I think that's a big part of fandom and spectatorship, and putting your identity on the line as a fan is a big part of it, which is why I think fans are ecstatic when their teams win and devastated when they lose. I mean, there's other kinds of fans that are going to be just more aesthetic, you know, just love a good game, right? You know, and that's a lot of ways I think a lot of people watch the Olympics. Like, it's exciting to see people going down on skeleton. It's just insane, right? But I don't have, you know, I want to see the Americans win, but it's not a big deal if they don't. I don't really care, in a deep way. But, you know, when it's the Red Sox, the Patriots, I mean, my identity, so much of who I am is wrapped up in that. So when they win or lose, it's part of me. Yeah. And, you know, that may not be healthy, but I think there's some value to it. Yeah. I mean, it certainly can get out of hand, and be overvalued, but I think there is a real value to that. And I think that he's kind of speaking to that. And there's this imagination aspect of not just the aesthetics of it, which is a part of his argument, but that there's an engagement of your whole being by being a part of this enterprise that becomes the sport, by being the spectator there, rather than just reading about it in the paper the next day. There's something different about it from the spectator's point of view that adds to the overall thing, but also adds to your own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Said well, like a person who's been teaching sports ethics. I like your perspective, and I'm particularly pleased that you chose this article, because it's been a long time, like I say, since I'd read it, and being able to go over it again and take it a little more seriously, and then see it in the context of what I know you do on a regular basis is kind of cool. So makes me want to develop a curriculum around it myself. So.
Well, I think I will find a way to include this in one of my courses in the future, because I do think it's I'm not sure whether I do it in the beginning when we talk first just about the value of sport in general, or bring it in when we talk about fandom. But I do think it's a worthwhile article to bring in. I mean, one, it's just beautiful. I mean, there's great lines. One of my favorite lines is, motives are always easy to assign unless we wish to get the real one. And that's just great.
Yeah.
But also, a lot of what he says, even though it's over 100 years old, really could come right out of current issue of Journal of Philosophy of Sport. He anticipates, a lot of what is in, play theory and sport theory about seriousness and non-seriousness. He really kind of anticipates some of that. He's lockstep with this idea of autotelicity, as it's sometimes called, the idea of it as something as an end in itself, right? And he really sees sport, you can see it in here where he talks about it as being at its best an end in itself, pursued as an end in itself. And that's a big part of current scholarship in philosophy of sports. I think he anticipates a lot of what we're going to come up. And so it's really fascinating to see the bits and pieces that are already there that other people also either get from him or just spontaneously come at themselves. And so that I think it makes it definitely a worthwhile read, and it's just beautiful to read. It's fun.
You just completely gave me the idea now I'm going to send an email to my friend Glenn Tiller, who is the editor of Overheard in Seville, which is the Journal of Santayana Studies, and that's published every year out of the proceedings of the Santayana Society meetings, which are at the APA every year. And you'll be invited. You need to write on that. So you just put yourself on the hook on that one. You're going to have to follow up those great comments with writing a piece on it, because that's really not developed at all. I mean, there have been a few renowned authors certainly who've talked about Santayanas. There's Irving Singer has certainly talked about aspects of Santayanas comments on sport, but it's embedded in a larger discussion he's having of Santayana on love and aesthetics and things like that. So the specific comment on the relationship between Santayana and how his ideas might speak to contemporary philosophy of sport is a wide open thing to write on. So, well,
it's an idea. I'll keep that in mind on the back burner. I got a couple of projects in the hopper, but
well, Bill Gahan. I mean, as another point of advertisement, Bill Gahan and I will be driving to Chicago when is the Central APA? It's like February 20-something. It's coming up soon.
Well, I know I'm presenting. There will be a International Association for the Philosophy of Sports session on Thursday, February 27th at 5:30. So
it's 2 Thursdays from now.
Yeah.
So yeah,
there'll be more on my blog about who's speaking. But
okay. So you're going to?
I will be there Thursday night.
We'll have to hook up. We're going Thursday night and staying through Friday, if I'm not mistaken, but our session's early Thursday morning. So Bill's going to talk about Santayana and Shakespeare.
Oh, cool.
And I'll be commenting on that. So you'll have to be the next guest. And it's a yearly thing.
All this, confluence.
Yeah.
Cool stuff. All right, thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Shawn. That's a lot of fun.
This has been the Sports Ethicist Show. You can find us at sportsethicist.com, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.